This week here on Mastering Dungeons, in our main segment, we're going to continue our look at the 2025 Monster Manual, comparing the design of the 2014 monsters with the 2025 versions. Last time we talked about a few monsters, but we didn't get even close to as far as we wanted to. So we are going to dig right back in right now and start talking about Empyreans. For those out there, Teos, who aren't already thumbing through or looking at or studying the videos that have come out about the Monster Manual, what are Empyreans?
Well, they're defined. Now monsters have this little abbreviation, so we get scions of the gods. And they can be found anywhere, and their treasures are relics. They are the spawn of deities. While not gods themselves, they possess divine influence and powers related to their divine parents. And this was a preview that went out to one of the creators that they got to show it off on their YouTube. So we got to see the actual full page description. There is a table of features, 1d6 features, like number 1 is balanced, naturalistic, or suggestive of watching eyes. Or number 6 is morbid, menacing, or monstrous, or that embody the viewer's fears.
Okay. Yeah. And we get a CR1 version of this normal. The main Empyrean is CR21, I believe, CR23, CR23. But we get a smaller version, a baby Empyrean, if you will, called an Empyrean Iota. And these are really fascinating to me. These CR1 monsters are just the tiniest wisps of the divinity of a thing that focuses on a particular belief or theme. So it's sort of, if a deity has this thought of, I wonder what's going on with this follower of mine, this iota would spring forth and go and find this person.
Yeah.
And I love that idea. I think that idea, not only story wise, but mechanically, you could have so much fun with.
Yeah.
So can we start with the iota stat block since it's the smaller
Yeah.
one?
Yeah. And the first thing that I thought was interesting was it looks it says medium, celestial, or fiend. Then the type is Titan and neutral. So one thing I thought was, okay, you gave it an alignment, which I wasn't sure if this would be like the kind of creature that says typically. Well, I don't see the word typically anymore for alignment. It's also not unaligned or varies. It's just neutral. And it can be a celestial or a fiend, which is an interesting way to do this. What else did you see?
Yeah, I that's the first thing I noticed is that if it's embodying the essence, some small thought, memory, or indirect attention of a deity, it would have a worldview.
Yeah.
Not only would it would have a serious worldview, right?
And
if
did.
If this was
in 2014. It was chaotic good 75% of the time, or neutral evil 25%, and it was considered a celestial in both cases. So that's a change there.
Yep. And so I wanted it to not have an alignment. Well, I don't want any of these alignments.
Oh, interesting. Because it's otherworldly.
As a game master, right? I want this thing should be memorable, right? If it is the attention of a pit fiend or some demon or devil powerful, it would have rage, it would have avarice, it would have something that would make it memorable. So as I'm going through and looking at what it does, incorporeal movement makes sense. It's not a physical thing. It can move through other creatures or objects. Great. Magic resistance makes sense. It's a powerful magical thing, so it would have advantage on saving throws. Otherworldly strike. Okay, it can, when it's next to you or from a range of up to 30 feet, it can hit you for necrotic or radiant damage. Makes sense. If it's a fiend, it will do necrotic. If it's a good deity, well, what about neutral deities? Who knows? But then we get spell casting, and this is where it got a little weird for me. So spell casting is once per day. It can do one each of these: bless, and lesser restoration. And I went, what if it's a demon or a devil? What if it's a fiend? Would it bless? Why would it bless? Why not bane? Why
Right.
not have bane as a choice?
Yeah.
Because, or even if it's from a god, but it's from a god who doesn't like what you're doing and wants to stop you, it should have a way to do that other than 7 points of necrotic or radiant damage.
Yeah. Best blessing its allies doesn't seem like the move it would make.
No, no. And so I understand why it's there. I just want that one more thing. And
Mm-hmm.
then I saw as a bonus action, so spellcasting, of course, is now under actions. Let me go back to that. Spellcasting is under actions, so it can do bless and it can do lesser restoration. And after lesser restoration, it says as an action. And I'm like, okay, it wasn't lesser restoration always an action? No, lesser restoration is a bonus action now, but it can cast it or it has to cast it as an action. And I'm like, why? And
Yeah.
why not as a bonus action? Since that's what the spell is. Is there a reason I'm missing?
No, and I mean it's not like I don't believe we had the Empyrean iota before. This is a new,
Right.
again, that sort of idea of a different CR. And if we look
Yeah.
at the Empyrean itself, which was also shown off in the video, it does not have these spells before, so it's not like they had to try to preserve it or something like that. Not that they took that approach, but they decided to put this on here for this specific guy. And it is weird, this idea that like you said, it could be a celestial or fiend, but it's doing lesser restoration on you. What fiend sends its agent to do that? I don't know.
Right. Yeah.
And as an action for no reason whatsoever. Okay. Yeah.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
the thing is, it's not like it doesn't have bonus actions, and that one's also interesting, right?
Yeah. And you know what I'm saying here. So we have a bonus action section, which I'm cool with, and it says healing word once per day. The Empyrean casts healing word using the same spellcasting ability as spellcasting. So I wondered how they were going to do this. If they have a spellcasting section, but one of the spells there is a bonus action, would they leave it under spellcasting or would they put it under bonus action? And they are separating it out.
Yeah.
And I'm of two minds about this. One says yes, please. Everything that's a bonus action, put under bonus actions. Everything that's action, put under action. I can totally get with that to make it very, very simple for DMs to go, okay, I can do one action, I choose that. Okay, I can do one bonus action, I choose that. I don't want to have to look for my bonus actions in actions. However, by separating it out, there's one, two, three, four, 3 lines plus a header that you're adding to a stat block that you could just put that spell up under spell casting and maybe do parentheses B next to it.
Well, and they
To show
did
that it's a
say
bonus
lesser
action.
restoration as an action, so it's not like they didn't take the words to tell you when something is a different action economy type, right? Like,
Right. Yeah.
literally in the
So,
same stat block, they could have just said healing word as a bonus action.
right.
And
So
especially because it's
Yeah.
useless. Well, and maybe it's because, no, I guess it doesn't matter because spellcasting is using wisdom. I was thinking the bonus action thing is also interesting because all these words, healing word once per day, cast healing word, using the same spellcasting ability as spellcasting, is useless to the average DM. You already said spellcasting uses wisdom up above. And none of that really helps me if I don't have healing word memorized and I don't know what it does. I have to open it up and figure out what the range is, how much it heals, do the math on how much it heals, right? Because I get my spellcasting bonus and all of that.
Yeah. I'm at least seeing both sides
Sure.
of this. But it's an interesting. This is a conundrum that many a
Yeah.
designer has when trying to reconcile space and word count, but also clarity, but also doing the same thing over and over and over, even if it's not perfect for one situation, it may be good in another situation. So you still do it. It's it's one of those things where I just like, okay, yeah, design is hard,
Yeah.
and I don't well, I don't want to be the one that has to do it, but I am
No, it's
often the one
tough.
that has to do it.
Well, yeah, and I talk about this in a video this week. It's especially hard if you think of the 2014 Monster Manual is a really good book. And when you think of like what needs to change, it's a small list. It's a general sort of list rather than a specific one, right? Most DMs do not have a huge catalog of, boy, you've got to fix all these things. It's a really good book. And if you think about the things you might want to change, you might say like, oh, more lore or whatever, but then you got to run into space issues, right? With any of these kind of big general things. It's a tough thing. I'll pivot and say I do like how they at times innovate with some pieces. And when we get to the Empyrean itself, not the Oda we just talked about, but the larger CR23, it has a really neat thing with this sacred weapon action it can take. And you roll to hit. If you hit, you do some force damage, and then the target is stunned until the start of the Empyrean's next turn. But the target can choose not to be stunned. And then it takes an extra 21 force damage that bypasses resistance or immunity. What do you think about that?
I let me say I cautiously approve of this. But only if it's used very rarely. One of the things I'm always keeping in mind when I set up choices like this is how is it going to slow down play for not just the average table, but for the table that likes to discuss things, right? And if we start getting this in every third monster, where it's like, okay, you can fall prone, get that prone, or take 5 more points of damage. It turns into a one min-maxing game. Okay, wait, let me think this through. And if you're a quick thinker, it's still going to take you 10 seconds. And if you're a slow thinker, it might take longer to figure out what is the optimal solution. And Lord help us all if the whole table decides to, no, don't fall prone, take the 5 because there are 4 more creatures going to attack you. And that gives them advantage, which is a 20% better chance of hitting you, and 20% chance of better hitting you if they're doing 10 points of damage each time, is essentially this, which adds up to more than 5 points, right? Just me making this random stuff off the cuff has already taken a minute, and we don't want that.
Yeah.
However, it's a cool thing when it's once and it's right.
Yeah, and it's nice. It's a sort of thing we haven't seen, I think, in 2014. At least I can't think of an example like it. I like seeing that sort of every now and then something makes you go, oh, wow. And your players will react that way. They'll go, wait, what? Oh, that's interesting.
Yeah, the other thing I've noticed from the Empyrean over 2014 to 2024 is the magic weapons trait is now gone. So before it would say that the creature's attacks are considered magical. And I think in more than one stat block that we've seen, that's been gone. So it looks like not only are they getting rid of that trait, but they're getting rid of this whole resistance to non-magical attack stuff. They seem to be going with force damage as a cure-all to this must be harmed by magical weapons to do full damage.
Yeah, it all can drive play one way or the other. I'm already hearing people in the Adventurers League talk about how the brooch of shielding has gone from, the useless thing you carried around to, wait a minute, I must have resistance against, force damage. And so it's all, I don't know. And I get why we want, every now and then we have a monster like the skeleton where it matters whether it's slashing or piercing or bludgeoning, but it so often doesn't, and then we're just always talking about what could just be weapon damage, but we have to list all 3 out, and we say it, right? You take 5 slashing damage, when it almost never matters, right? It's like this thing you have to do for those few exceptions.
Yeah. We just call it fighting damage.
Fighting.
Well, we were playing once, and I was DMing, and somebody said I do 20 points of damage with my sword. And I'm like, well, what kind of damage? And he got all flustered. He's like, fighting damage. And I'm like, all right, that works for me. It's fighting damage
Yeah.
now.
Yeah, that's fair. Mm-hmm.
But yeah, that's one of those holdovers. The resistant to non-magical weapons, to
Yeah.
piercing, slashing, bludgeoning from non-magical sources, blah blah blah. That I understand why it's there, and thematically or narratively, it's been in our stories forever, right? You need magic to harm this creature. You need silver to harm that creature. You need cold iron to harm that creature. But we've gotten rid of a lot of it. So I think this was just a next logical step to that.
And you've noticed the giant jump in initiative, right? Which I thought was interesting because so the 2014 Empyrean, doesn't list initiative. That's a 2025 change. So it's its dex is the same. It gets a +5 bonus added to something that would use the dex, in this case initiative. So it should be +15, but here it's +19, that's big.
It is. You're going to get at least a 20. Even
Yes,
if you're
you
rolling
are.
with disadvantage, you're going to get at least a 20.
Yeah. The
So
other thing I noticed was the parenthetical 29. Right. So they show you the +10 initiative on these monster examples, which I did not think they would do that. Right. It's sort of, some folks like that. The idea, we talked about initiative in the earlier segment. I don't like just adding 10 to it. I find that leads with a lot of monsters being all chucked into the middle. Because initiatives, while these are wild swings, they often end up all in the middle if you do that. So I don't love the +10 method.
Yeah, and I'm down with a higher initiative for monsters, especially at that CR. I think it's players. I see players get into the 30s with certain builds, and always in the 20s. So I'm good with that. Do you want to hit the ancient gold dragon next?
Yeah, I'll try to hit it somewhat fast because it's an enormous stat block. Speaking of high initiatives, +16. The Ancient Gold Dragon is a CR24 monster, and it was kind of neat. It's a guy that all these links are in our show notes. So D&D Beyond had a webpage where they talked about the Ancient Gold Dragon and it used it as an illustration of what's going on in stat blocks in 2025, what each of the sections are meant to do, and how they've changed them up. The thing I wanted to know with the Ancient Gold Dragon, one is how it had changed from the Ancient Green Dragon we saw before, which, as we mentioned, the reactions are gone, the legendary actions are back. How it would do things like spells, because it's got spell casting. So one thing that happened that I'm really, and I'll just go, since I just said spells, let's talk about this right now.
Mm-hmm.
Mordenkainen's, that redid monsters, right, which was sort of a soft redo of monsters, depending how soft will be your perspective. We got these blog posts talking about the mentality, and Jeremy Crawford would talk through, hey, if it's an attack thing, it's not going to appear in a spell list. It's going to be down below as an action. And you now will know what to do, and you can use it easily because you don't have to go look this up. And I thought that was brilliant, personally, for me. Not everybody agrees. But then when Mordenkainen's actually arrived as a book, that was sometimes true, but sometimes not. And the version that was in the action wasn't like, help me know what it is. It was sometimes something different. It wasn't quite the spell, and you couldn't counterspell it or dispel it or whatever. It was sort of weird. It's like a spell-ish version. Well, here we get an example of how 25 is doing it, which is not like Mordenkainen's, and especially not like that blog. So in our spell list, we have At Will things, which includes Guiding Bolt in a level 4 version. We have Flame Strike once per day as a level 6, as well as various other things that are sort of more tactical utility, Word of Recall, Zone of Truth. And these, what this does is when you're trying to be effective as a DM, it forces you to look it up, right? And see whether you want to use this both situationally, what is the area of effect of Flame Strike, but also, should I do this instead of breathing or rending or whatever? And you've now got to look this up for all of your offensive spells. In this case, 2 Guiding Bolt and Flame Strike. And sometimes these spells appear in these monsters because the point is to give them a ranged option.
Mhm.
But you don't know that. You don't know if this is a burst of damage or is it. And while I say all paths lead to CR, they don't necessarily, right? I'll pause there. What do you think about that?
No, I agree, and I love the idea of anything offensive. Give it a action
Mm-hmm.
thing. Uh, Counterspell arguments aside,
Yeah.
uh, I love the idea of, all right, we're out of combat. I can look up Word of Recall. I can look up Zone of Truth.
Yeah.
I'll let the players play role play amongst themselves while I flip through and look this up. But in combat, I want to keep things moving, and I don't want to have to stop and look up the spell. Uh, so I would have loved to have kept it in the action section.
Yeah. Yeah. So
And oh,
I'm glad. Yeah. Go ahead.
it's worse because now Guiding Bolt is not just this one off that you can cast, but it's part of multi attack.
Yeah.
Now, sure, once you look it up once, hopefully you don't close the book and have to look it up again, although that's something I would totally do. Uh, but, that's something that's always going to be going off. So it becomes even more important to have access to it.
Yeah. Um, and so yeah, the multi attack says 3 rend attacks. You can replace one of those with A, spellcasting to cast the level 4 guiding bolt, or B, your weakening breath. And I like that as a tactical thing, though it does make things quite complex because now you've got to consider all of that, right? Your rend is 28 damage total. Your weakening breath is not damage, but gives disadvantage in a 90-foot cone. So is that worth it? Your guiding bolt is going to do less damage than your rend, I think. It's either that or the same, but it's ranged. It's close. But you've got to look this all up and what's the range of it and what happens. Well, I'll get advantage if I hit. All these things. It's a bit messy, and I try to remember that a lot of these monsters, a little different with the Ancient Gold Dragon, but in a lot of these monsters that have these kinds of features, they're not going to be around for that long. So do I really need all of these options? It's a bit complicated, right? I don't love it. The fire
Yeah.
breath is huge, right? This is a 90-foot cone, 71 fire damage or half. That's an enormous thing. And so the idea of, all paths lead to the same DPR, well, you need to get that fire breath in, and you want to make sure you focus that on as many characters as possible if they need a threat, if that's what's going to be fun. It's not the same as doing a rend, right? Maybe all path leads because the idea is one of those rounds you're doing it because it's a recharge 5 to 6, but that kind of thing there it adds to all of this. The other thing is it has legendary actions, right? So you've got your multi-attack, you've got your rend, you've got your fire breath, you've got your spell casting you look up, you've got your weakening breath you look up. Then we've got our legendary actions. We get 3 of them or 4 if we're in our layer. So that's a nice way to boost the being in a layer. And your options are 3, and they are Banish, Guiding Light, or Pounce. Pounce is simple. You move half your speed and get to rend. That's awesome because you get a little mobility if you need it. Your Guiding Bolt as well, if you can't get to anything, even with a Pounce, I guess that's an okay option. But you'd Pounce otherwise. And then you get Banish. What do you think of that?
I think, well, the first thing I notice is that there used to be numbers like points that you would use, and you could
Yeah.
use 2 points for this, 3 points if it was a really strong thing, but you'd use all your points. Now it's everything I've seen, at least so far, it's all one action, one use of
Yeah.
legendary action. Uh, and I've always been cool with legendary actions.
Mm-hmm.
When they were going to get rid of them and instead give several reactions, I wasn't a huge fan. So I'm totally fine to go back to this.
Well, Shawn, we do get that text, and this is something that's 2025 specific, where at the end, when they do what would have been a 3.1, they say failure or success, the dragon can't take this action until the start of its next turn. So that means Banish you can only use once.
True.
per round, right? And you'll see that with the kind of more powerful one usually, or whichever they think kind of should be limited. So it's like a 3-point, but I like you said, I like not having to count those points up.
Yeah. Yeah. I had a question going back to actions.
Yeah.
Yeah, everything's alphabetical except when it isn't. So multi-attack, I think it comes
Always
first no
first.
matter what.
Yeah. Yeah.
And then rend comes second before fire breath. So it goes multi-attack and then rend, so the melee attack. Fire breath comes next, even though it's not alphabetical. So it's that. But then spellcasting comes next. And then after that comes weakening breath. So they've separated the two breaths with spellcasting because it's alphabetical. But they don't do alphabetical anywhere else. And
so it's like alphabetical except the multi-attack's main thing or something like that. Wow.
Right. And so I prefer spellcasting at the end. Because then I always know where it is. If I need to look there, I'll just go to the next header and look up. And so I thought that was weird how they did it alphabetical, except none of it's alphabetical.
That's so interesting. Yeah. Well, and I do want to say that is fascinating because it contributes to that whole, you got to look all over the place to figure it out. I do want to go back and just say one thing about Banish, which is it's fascinating on a number of grounds in its tactical richness. One is it's DC 24, so that's rough.
Yep.
120-foot range that a creature the dragon can see. When you fail, 24 damage, and they are incapacitated and transported to a demi-plane until the start of the dragon's next turn. When you get to that point, you now can choose to put it within 120 feet of the dragon, at the target. So you can put them 120 feet up in the air if you're outdoors or an enormous cavern. You can put them above the lava. You can, it's really interesting. You can put them in where you're going to breathe, right? So there's a lot of tactical angle to this Banish that I really love. And someone who play tested a combat with this, they said the Banish is the thing that makes this gold dragon brutal because you can take out that big damage dealer and you can put them wherever you need to, right?
Yeah.
I mean, if it's a melee person that can't move very quickly, 120 feet away might be a problem.
This is a CR24 monster.
Sure.
So you're probably dealing with 18, 19, 20th level characters.
Yeah. But still, sometimes, right, you run that table and you realize, the fighter has no way to move closer than just their 30-foot movement or something. You never know.
Mm-hmm. I'm wondering if space is a game term. It's not capitalized, so I assume that they don't. Sorry. When I saw it says, it puts you in a space and you set up in the air. It makes sense unless we are told that it can't be.
I don't believe there's anything prohibiting, putting you in damaging terrain. I think there are some examples where it'll say something that suggests, kind of indicates you can't put it in a place that's damaging or, it's a safe and occupied. I feel like there's some wording I saw somewhere like that.
Yeah. The only thing I see is playing on a grid where it says entering a square. To enter a square, you must have enough movement left to pay for entering. It costs 1 square of movement to enter an unoccupied square that's adjacent to your space. And it says orthogonally or diagonally adjacent. So I guess that.
I mean, I think it all counts. I think you can put them, in the air above the lava pit for falling damage and lava damage.
Sounds like a plan.
Yeah. What I also did here, and if folks check out my videos that I'll be putting out, I've broken down, I've gone through the ridiculous process of adding up all the damage for all these monsters. And how you calculate this damage will vary on what you think about the area of effect, right? That's 71 damage to each target. The old 2014 way was to say that even in that absurdly large 90-foot cone, that this flying dragon's only going to get 2 targets. And there's no way I'm running this combat and only getting 2 targets in that. So I calculate a little bit differently on the damage, and I'll talk about that in my videos. But when I calculated this DPR, it is an impressive 231. The 2014 guideline in the DMG for the CR24 was 204. So this is, about a 15% increase over the guideline. And the average found in published monsters for CR24 was only 120. So it's close to double what we found in the published books. Forge of Foes also uses the guideline of around 204. So, it is hitting harder than Forge of Foes, which is a fairly strong fight at high CRs. So that's really interesting, especially because your encounter rules allow for this dragon to be met earlier than it was under 2014 rules. So that could also make it even harder, right? You're meeting it at a lower level. So that's really interesting. How does that measure against the characters being stronger? Boy, hard to say.
It is hard to say, and that's why it's going to be so interesting once the book is actually out and in widespread use as we see experiences and numbers and analysis start to come in, where we're actually using the player characters as the reference instead of theoretically or charts or what have you. I have a strong feeling that the characters are going to be even stronger than they were. And so threats like this 24 CR24 monster sounds great until everybody makes their saving throw every time.
Well, and that can be okay, right? Like, I mean, one of the big things about the Forge of Foes advice is we're telling you, hey, for that difficulty your group is hitting, here's what you can do about it. And it just takes knowing where the new level is, right? We've got to figure out what that new math is so that we work off of it. The monster, understanding the monsters, the encounters, and the players, because all three have changed, and that requires then going back and retooling your approach.
Yep. I want to talk about the Vampire Familiar for a second.
Cool.
Because I thought, again, like the Empyrean Iota, I thought this was a great story concept. We didn't have a Renfield type monster with vampires. So I was happy to see this, that the Vampire Familiar is not a familiar as we think of them going with wizards. They're thralls of a vampire who are humanoid, not undead, but humanoids, but who have this connection to the vampire and allow the vampire to do things through this familiar without actually being there.
Yeah.
And so there are many times when we've told stories in previous editions of D&D, including 2014, where we sort of had to rely on the vampire spawn.
Yeah.
Which is okay, except they're undead. And they ding, ding, ding under scrutiny. Whereas this Vampire Familiar shouldn't. And I love that. I love that story-wise. I love that there's the ability to do that now. Sadly, within 2 years, everyone is going to have the stat block memorized. And so they will search for the umbral dagger that the Vampire Familiar has. But,
Yeah, I mean, I checked this person. Do they have exactly 10 daggers? Oh, that's a Vampire Familiar.
It's a Vampire Familiar. But let's talk about it. What does this monster do? It's a CR3 monster, armor class of 15, and its dex is only +3, but we don't get. I don't think under gear we only get daggers, so I'm not sure where the extra +2 is coming from. But hey, that's I'm fine with that. It has dark vision, even though it's a humanoid. Very stealthy and has good perception, but its main trait is this vampire connection. So while the familiar and its vampire master are on the same plane, the vampire can communicate with the familiar telepathically, and the vampire can perceive through the familiar senses, i.e., the vampire can see you
and give you instructions and give its
well, no,
familiar instructions. Yeah.
it can give the familiar instructions, but it can see you, player
You.
character.
Yeah.
The vampire has eyes on you. Now, if you give the vampire spells that rely on you being able to see,
Mm-hmm.
you have some interesting ways to
Hmm.
interact.
Yeah, possibly. Yeah, yeah.
The only thing that I'm sad about is
Hmm.
that it's a CR3 creature. So I'm like, okay, that's tough. That's a
Mm-hmm.
not a pushover. It's not a guard, right? It's not a
Right.
bandit. And it gets 2 attacks with its umbral dagger, which it can obviously throw or use in melee, but it does 7 points of necrotic damage. Now the
Plus
target
5
is
piercing.
what's that?
Plus 5
Oh,
piercing.
sorry, 5 piercing plus 7 necrotic. Okay. So that's good. And the target is reduced. If the target is reduced to 0 hit points, it becomes stable and has the poison condition for 1 hour. And it's paralyzed while it has this.
Mm-hmm.
So at low levels, if you're first level or second level and you're dealing with one of these things, okay, that's rough. But if you're a higher level character who's actually fighting a vampire, that feels too weak to me. I
Mm-hmm.
want there to be I want this monster to work against first and second level characters and against 12th level characters fighting a vampire. And I feel like it doesn't do both.
Well, can I blow your mind, sir?
Please.
And again, now that by the time this airs, we can talk about it. So
Yeah.
the vampire familiar at CR3 does 12 points of damage twice, so 24 per round.
Right.
The vampire itself is CR13 and does
Yeah.
49 damage per round.
Okay. So
That's one of the things
twice.
that I've been scratching my head about the most in the monster manual. And especially because they talked about vampires on one of their videos and they highlighted how these are better.
Mm-hmm.
And I would like to know how my CR13 is. The vampire does only 49 a round, including all of what it does. And
Okay.
the vampire Umbral Lord does 142. So there's a giant difference. Maybe
Right.
I'm missing something and I'm looking at the vampire stat block wrong. Once everybody can look at it, and you can tell me where I went wrong. The vampire Nightbringer does 38. It's CR8. I don't know what happened to those. So they may need the vampire familiar to come in and fight for them.
That's true. Does that include a reduction of hit points from their maximum?
Maybe that's what's driving it. It could be that the vampire is seen as a hit and run. They do have some capabilities that are neat around that sort of hit and run type concept, but you know how it is. Your players can surprise you with their ability to lock something down or prevent you from getting away. And just also the idea to me is you have to be able to scare your players a bit, hit them hard. If you want to get away and run, that's to me an encounter story type thing. Not that the monster should therefore be weak at attacking. And the vampire itself, it's an enormous stat block. In fact, it might be one of 2 full-page stat blocks in the book. It's one of the few. There aren't very many that occupy the entire page, nothing else on it. And for all that the vampire does that, it just doesn't deal a lot of damage. And its legendary actions don't, make up for it. It's rough. Yeah.
Okay. I haven't looked, as far as you know, have not looked at the vampire. I know they're rough to make, having made them a lot of them or overseen the making of a lot of them for the Monster Grimoire for 2014. Those monsters that have a lot of legend around them are a tough nut to crack, but that's very interesting.
Yeah. Yeah,
Okay.
I'll go back and double check it because it's on my list actually to go back and like make sure I didn't get this wrong, because it just shocks me how low the damage is. But all of the vampires sort of felt that way. Like its multi attack for a vampire is to do an attack that does 15 twice, and then an attack that does 19. And yeah, that does reduce your hit points, but
yeah.
And maybe the idea is I'm just charming lots of people and that commanding you so you aren't acting, but that's a lot of ifs, and I worry about that design.
Well, we have time for one more monster. Is there one you specifically wanted to look into, talk about? Lead us off.
All right. So the Gargoyle is interesting because it was an absolute beast in 2014 because not only was it very capable, hit hard, did well, but it was taking, was it immune to non-magic items? Or was it resistant? I'll have to look.
I think resistant, yeah.
Okay. So it was, but that alone, that was really, really a big deal. And that is gone. I will say that, and I'm going to look at the Gargoyle 2014 and pull that up here. Yeah, so it was resistant to non-magic that wasn't adamantine. That was a big deal to it. So it has gotten a small hit point bump, but not enough to make up for that. It now has a flyby, which is new, so it can attack without drawing opportunity attacks. But otherwise, it's making 2 claw attacks for 7 damage each as a CR2. And that is a small amount of damage increase over what it used to do. It used to do 10, but it now loses that kind of defensive part that it had that was such a big part of it. It also loses its false appearance, which I thought was interesting. To me, that's a very big part of a gargoyle. And I won't talk about how it should be called or grotesque, but people on my Discord have heard about it. But I thought that was interesting because this is one of the ones that I was like, oh, gargoyles, man, you're going to be in fighting them for a while because of that half damage kind of angle. And which I also liked because it meant that casters got to shine and that kind of thing, and that's gone. Immunity to non-magic, where you need non-magic and you're either immune or resistant, is essentially gone in 2025. What isn't gone are immunities and resistances, and the number of monsters with them is enormous. So there's a lot of that. Most monsters have one or the other, if not both, which is interesting.
Yeah. I'm interested in the gargoyle losing the false appearance but gaining stealth.
Yeah.
And I'm wondering if that's going to be what replaces it. Because I can totally see a game reason to do that. Because if you enter the library and there are all these statues, and the player says, well, I look at the statues to make sure they're not gargoyles. And false appearance really doesn't tell you what to do with that.
I mean, it's indistinguishable, right? That's false appearance.
But what does that mean? Does that mean you can't even make a check? You can't make a Arcana check, an insight check, anything?
Yeah, I mean, because I think gargoyles are basically living
that, hey,
stone.
At least you can make a perception check to see if it's moving. I don't.
Yeah. I think that, but to me, I like that because to me, it speaks to the gargoyle's nature as being an elemental. It is stone. It's like when the Galabdur, right, is just sitting there as a boulder. If it doesn't talk to you or open its eyes, it's a boulder. And there's no reason to see anything else there. And it doesn't need to itch or blink or breathe, so there is no perception check to be made. I would argue, I think it's great. And same thing with a mimic. A mimic is just so otherworldly that if it wants to be a chest or a sword or whatever, it can be. And you're not going to figure out what it is. And so I actually liked false appearance, but I get what you're saying.
Yeah, I'm interested in if any creature will now have that false appearance, and I'm guessing not.
I think they don't. I think they have changed to address it in some other way that isn't the false appearance angle. Like I think the mimic. I'll look it up here, but it's which is interesting, right? It's that, and it goes to that whole 2024 versus 2014. What are you trying to do with it? and why. So the Mimic has now a bonus action Shapeshift. And this actually appears in a number of monsters with slightly different wording. But in this case, the Mimic shape shifts to resemble a medium or small object while retaining its game statistics, or it returns to its true blob form. Any equipment it is wearing or carrying isn't transformed. So now you can detect a Mimic, right? You can just look at it from afar and go, I want to make a check. And I guess, I don't know what it would, is it in that case making, I guess for the Mimic, it has stealth +5 in 2025, 2024. So you would roll against that.
Well, you wouldn't just roll against that, Teos. You know what you would do is would make.
I would take an action to make a.
It's not study. Study is intelligence. Well, if you're going to investigate, you would study. If you are, what's the
search?
Search. There you go.
Search action, which would be your perception versus study, which would be your investigation. Yeah. So I guess you make that action and you would, but I don't like it, right? I mean, I think that the Mimic should just surprise you because it's that otherworldly, and I think the Gargoyle, you can't tell, and you can shoot it with an arrow, and you're going to damage that rock, and then you can decide as DM, does my Gargoyle decide to reveal itself because it doesn't like that you're shooting it with arrows, but it also could just sit there.
Sure.
True.
Yeah, it's
I don't think that's an enormous issue, but it goes into that whole concept of, they have made changes, they have gone through every monster and truly changed these all in ways big and small. And so you don't know what a monster will exactly be, other than if it was the same name, it will still be the same CR. But aside from that, anything could have changed, and you have to look at that new stat block if you want to run the new version. I will say one last thing, which is I did pick up some 50th anniversary minis.
Ooh,
and you tell me, is the 5th edition Pit Fiend better than the 1st edition Pit Fiend?
I got to go with the 1st edition, I think.
Yeah, me too. Me too.
Yeah.
I did, however, really, really love the one other one I'll show off is they had 1st edition versus 5th edition for this guy. So here's your 1st edition, right? Classic from the cover of the player's handbook. Yeah. And then the guy who's standing up to attack you, which appears in, one of the books for 5th edition. And you can see he's missing an eye. He's getting up to punch you because you stole it.
You stole his gem eye, and now he's upset.
I love it, right? This is great.
And his groin region is getting burned quite severely. Hopefully he's immune to fire, because that would also cause me to be upset.
Yeah, for sure.
Oh, with that, we are going to close this puppy down. Thank you so much out there for listening. If you would like to support us through our Patreon, you can do so by going to patreon.com/masteringdnd. We've got a bevy of supporters out there already doing so. Some of them are Master of Dungeon supporters. Thank you. And for you, Teos is holding up the little standy up devil guy. For our Master of Realm supporters, I'm looking at your names in our show notes right now. And for our Masters of the Multiverse, well, you get a special shout out. Starting with Agile Monk of Fantasy Companion Workshops, Keith Ammon of The Monsters Know What They're Doing, Lou Anders of Lazy Wolf Studios, Craig Bailey, Dave Bastiansen, Steve Bissonette, Merrick Blackman, Calvin Bridges Avalos, Evil John, Evan at Nimble Co., Will Doyle, Andy Edmonds at NerdroNomicon.com, James Fisher, Scott Fitzgerald Gray at Insane Angel Studios, William Harshman of Runeforge Tabletop Gaming, Van Heidsler and Paige Lightman, Sean Hurst, Hyperlexic, Mark and Mary's Gaming Compound, The Mighty Jerd, JR of The Twilight Perspective, Brian King, Jim Klingler, a.k.a. DM Prime Mover, Chad Lynch, Paul Mata, The Mathematician, Eric Mengi, Anna B. Meyer of Fantasy Cartography, Trey McLemore, John Mickey, The Mighty Zeus, Sean Molly, Falcon Neal, Tom Nelson of The Deck of Player Safety, David Norris, Phil Wirt from the Philadelphia Area Gaming Expo, Frog Prince at Tentacles Squelching Wetly, Post Fiction RPG Audio, Robert Pasley, Vladimir Prenner from Croatia, Pugness, Ozymandias Rex, Runner Rick, Chance Russo, at Drago Russo, Andy Shakti, Krishna Samosa, Spark from Dunner Games, Josh and Liwa Nika of the Tabletop Journeys podcast, Hallis the Stormlord, Jeremy Talaman from the D&D and TV podcast, Therese, Joe Tyler, Marcelo de Velasquez, the Valiant DM, James Walton, Graham Ward, Jason Ward from Accidental Cyclops Games, Javier Wozniak, Chris Webster, Zach Types, and Zewalt Winfrey. Thank you so much. Again, if you would like to support us, if you're listeners out there who have been listening for a long time and you're ready to take that plunge, come join us in our Discord. Go to patreon.com/masteringdnd. Find out all the cool things happening there. You can also help us out by subscribing on our YouTube channel, which is youtube.com/@masteringdungeons, or leave us a review wherever you listen to the show. Go to YouTube's, like and subscribe, leave a review, do whatever you can. Spread the word, helps us out. Teos, what you been up to?
I've been looking at this monster manual a lot. So you can come to alphastream.org and go to the YouTubes and find me there talking about my opinions of this here book.
Mm-hmm. And you can find me on the socials at Shawn Merwin. You can follow the podcast at Mastering D&D. And, join us wherever you listen. Send us an email. Scream out your window. Whatever. We love it. Teos, we have gone through even more monsters awaiting the real drop for this monster manual. So what are we going to do now?
Well, I'm going to go to the local newspaper and put an ad in the classifieds to become a vampire familiar.
Mm-hmm. And I am about to retake my normal blob form.